Hey, Alex Kliment here from GZERO Media in New York, where we just learned of the death of Russian dissident Alexei Navalny, whom the Russian state media says died in prison. For those who don't know, Alexei Navalny was the most prominent and charismatic and media-savvy opponent to Vladimir Putin. And I can say, as someone who followed Russia for a number of years, that I was shocked but not surprised that Navalny has died. The question will immediately be asked, did Vladimir Putin kill him? One way or another, the answer is yes. We certainly don't know whether the Kremlin put a hit on Navalny in prison on the morning of February 16th or not, but certainly the Russian state has viewed Navalny as a major thorn in its side for a number of years. Navalny was put in extremely difficult conditions in prison. Of course, he's in jail on charges of extremism and corruption that are widely regarded as pretty bogus. And back in 2020, of course, Navalny was poisoned at a Siberian airport in an incident that he blamed on the Russian state. He was flown abroad for treatment in Germany and went back to Russia, defying Putin, and wound up in jail. I think one big question is where this will make the biggest waves. And I think, sadly, more outside of Russia than inside Russia. It is a curious paradox that although Putin certainly thought of Navalny as a threat, Navalny was well-spoken, he was a kind of hardcore nationalist in a lot of ways that made it hard to tar him as a Western agent, which is the kiss of death in Russia. He was someone who focused a lot on corruption within Putin's system, which is something certainly that Putin and his cronies did not want to hear. At the height of Navalny's power, he was able to get hundreds of thousands of people in the streets in 2011, 2012, protesting against what he called the ruling party of crooks and thieves. That was certainly something that Vladimir Putin and the crooks and thieves around him did not want a lot of people to hear. At the same time, if you look at polling of what Russians think broadly, Navalny was not hugely popular in Russia outside of the kind of set of well-educated elites in Moscow and St. Petersburg. There was a poll last year that only about 10% of Russians saw Navalny as someone whose activities they approved of. About 40 or 50% said they disapproved of Navalny, and fully a quarter of Russians had never even heard of him. That's a function of the fact that obviously the Kremlin controls the media. The Kremlin has cracked down on opposition movements like Navalny's. And of course, a lot of the supporters of Navalny, people most disposed to support him, have left Russia since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So inside of Russia, it's hard to see a huge reaction here. Outside of Russia, it will be bigger. I would pay attention particularly to how this shapes the debate in Washington about aid for Ukraine. Navalny's death doesn't have a lot to do directly with the Ukraine war, but certainly those who support more aid for Ukraine will be happy to tar those who oppose aid to Ukraine as helping a murderous dictator who has just offed one of his biggest critics, and that can, be toxic right now. The other question is, how will Western governments respond? The sad truth is there's not much they can do to respond. 2 years into the Ukraine war, Russia is about as isolated economically as the Western governments are willing to go. Certainly they could punish Russia more by sanctioning oil and gas exports, but nobody wants to do that because of the economic impact. So I think, sadly, the response from the West will be a lot of outrage and a lot of strongly worded statements, but not a whole lot of credible action. The biggest loser from all of this, I think it needs to be said, is the Russian people. Although Navalny was not widely popular, he was a uniquely charismatic, fearless, and media-savvy critic of the Putin regime, who will be extremely hard to replace. And I think insofar as he was a person who, with all his faults, and they were many, like with any sort of larger-than-life figure, with all his faults, he was trying to make Russia a more democratic and less corrupt place. And with his death, that, I think, becomes further out of reach. And ultimately, whether the Russian people know it or not, they are the biggest losers of Alexei Navalny's death. That's the wrap. From New York, Alex Kliment, GZERO Media.